Okay.
So we are recording.
So is there any action?
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't have anything on my screen.
Yeah, everybody that's just joining us now, we're just going to wait for about a minute to let everybody into the room, but I can see that we are filling up as I speak.
Oh, I see.
Mallin, over to you.
Welcome to our Canadian International Council members and guests. We're happy to have you here today at this Foreign Policy by Canadians event. My name is Mallin Jiang, and I am a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian International Council Victoria branch here on Vancouver Island. Before we do get underway, it is important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of Lekwungen-speaking First Peoples, the Songhees, and Esquimalt nations, and gratefully acknowledge the co-Salish nations on whose traditional territories we meet together. For those not familiar with Canadian International Council, we are an independent, nonpartisan, member-driven think tank with the express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs and promote a deeper understanding of Canada's role in the changing international landscape. What makes us different from many think tanks is that we have branches in 17 Canadian cities with some 1,400 members who are deeply involved with and interested in Canada's role in the world. You can find out more about us by Googling the Canadian International Council, where you can also find our CIC Victoria webpage. This afternoon, our moderator will be Dr. Victor V. Ramraj, and I will introduce him shortly. And then Victor will take over and introduce our panelists. Each panelist will have opening remarks, and then there will be a short discussion between the panelists, followed by an audience Q&A portion. And for this, please use the Q&A area, and we will do our best to get to all of them. We are also recording this event. As mentioned, our moderator today is Dr. Victor V. Ramraj, Director of the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives at the University of Victoria. Victor joined the University of Victoria as Professor of Law and CAPI Chair in Asia-Pacific Legal Relations in 2014. After 16 years at the National University of Singapore, where he twice served as the faculty's Vice Dean for Academic Affairs. He was also twice seconded to the Center for Transnational Legal Studies, a consortium of global law schools in London, where he served for 1 year as its co-director. He holds 5 degrees from McGill University, the University of Toronto, and the Queen's University, Belfast, served as judicial law clerk at the Federal Court of Appeal in Ottawa, and as a litigation lawyer in Toronto, and remains a non-practicing membership in the Law Society of Upper Canada. He has held visiting teaching appointments at Chulalongkorn University, Kyushu University, and the University of Toronto. His current research examines how national legal orders respond to and interact with economic globalization. I will now hand over to Victor.
Thanks very much, Mallin. That was far too kind. Let me just say that it's a great pleasure and honor to serve as moderator of today's discussion and my thanks to Chris Guilford and Mallin and the CIC for this invitation and opportunity. Our topic today, as you would know, is Canada and the Indo-Pacific. What next and where next for Canada's global trading interests? So let me make three brief contextual points on geography, security, and trade before introducing our distinguished panel. Geographically, the Indian Ocean is about as far away from Canada as possible on precisely the opposite side of the globe. And I checked on my globe today. And yet it is a region that is, according to many of the historians that I've been reading, and arguably in the present moment as well, more vibrant and important to world affairs than the Mediterranean, which is often the focus of our attention. And what we are seeing today is perhaps a reversion to the historical mean. Second, the importance of the Indo-Pacific extends to security. With the confluence of China's Belt and Road Initiative and the rise of the Quad powers, which many of you would know refers to the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, the Indian Ocean region has become central to global peace and security, as well as to climate change and displacement. Third, and of central importance to our discussion this afternoon, is its significance to global trade. Which is not surprising considering that the region holds well over half of the world's population and is at the center of competing and expanding trade blocs, whether the China-led RCEP or the CPTPP. So to help us think through the significance of the region, the Indo-Pacific region for Canada, I'm delighted to introduce our panel, whose profiles I'm afraid I've had to condense to ensure that we have enough time for our discussion this afternoon. So briefly and far too quickly, Hugh Stephens has more than 40 years of government and business experience in the Asia-Pacific region, including diplomatic postings in China, Hong Kong, South Korea, Pakistan, and Taiwan. He is currently vice chair of the Canadian Committee on Pacific Economic Cooperation. He's a distinguished fellow at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada and an executive fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. He also teaches in the MBA program at Royal Roads University as an associate faculty member. In recent years, he has written extensively, as I'm sure most of you know, in many leading publications on Canada's engagement with the Asia-Pacific region. Juan Navarro is a researcher, educator, and entrepreneur with over 20 years of experience in business, finance, trade, international trade, and entrepreneurship. His publications focus on international trade issues and free trade agreements in the Asia-Pacific region. He has worked as an associate faculty member in several business schools and has taught for 3 years at Royal Roads University. Juan also served for 10 years and as an economist at the Mexican Central Bank and as a member of a panel of experts at the World Bank Institute. Brian Parrott is an associate faculty member at Royal Roads University. He has an extensive experience in international commerce, economic policy analysis, and trade promotion. Brian retired from global affairs in 2018 after serving as Minister Commercial at the Canadian High Commission in New Delhi. He had previously served in the UK as Minister Counsel, Commercial and Senior Trade Commissioner, supporting Canadian commercial interests in the UK. He has also held trade-related roles in Seattle and Tokyo. Brian began his career in the BC provincial government and served as Assistant Deputy Minister, Energy and Mines. Phil Calvert spent 34 years in Canada's Foreign Service with postings in Beijing, including as Deputy Ambassador, and as Ambassador to Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos. At Global Affairs Canada, he was Director General for North Asia, a director in the Trade Policy Branch, and Deputy Chief Negotiator for China's accession to the WTO. He is currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Asia-Pacific Initiatives at UVic. Thank you, Phil. And a Senior Fellow at the China Institute at the University of Alberta. Phil holds a PhD in history from the University of Washington. And last but certainly not least, Margaret Cornish has had a distinguished foreign service career with postings in Beijing, with the Canadian delegation to the United Nations, and the Canadian delegation to the European Community. She subsequently joined the Bank of Nova Scotia, where she worked on sovereign debt restructuring, and then with Scotia Capital Markets on Canadian industrial companies. She has served as Executive Director of the Canada-China Business Council and as a member of the Economic Council of Canada, and has held adjunct professorships at Queen's University and Wilfrid Laurier. She has been an Associate Fellow of the CIC and has served as an advisor both to the law firm Bennett Jones and to Justin Trudeau during his time as Leader of the Opposition. She is currently an Honorary Research Fellow at the Institute for Asian Research at UBC. Whew, we are in extremely distinguished company. I'm sorry to have to run through that so quickly. Let me now turn you over to our panelists. Now, each panelist will speak for no longer than 10 minutes in the order in which I've introduced them. And then we will have a panel discussion and opportunity for Q&A. So with that, thank you. Hugh, over to you to set the stage for us.
Thank you, Victor, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to kick the ball off, so to speak, on this discussion of Canada and the Indo-Pacific. Let me start with terminology. Canadians are very familiar with the term Asia-Pacific. After all, we have been members of APEC for more than 30 years, and we have the Asia-Pacific Foundation, of which I'm a fellow, and so on. But they are less familiar, I believe, with the terminology Indo-Pacific. And I'd like to explore this a little bit in my opening comments so that some of the other comments can fit into the overall parameters of what Indo-Pacific is. Because language has meaning, and it's important, I think, to be clear what we're talking about when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. And Victor's already made a couple of comments in that regard. Of course, the Asia-Pacific region is generally considered to include East Asia or North Asia, if you like, Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand, the South Pacific, and the Western littoral of North and South America. If you add in the far eastern province of Russia, you have the complete Asia-Pacific picture. If Asia-Pacific is broad and a little bit elastic, consider the relatively new term and concept being used to describe the region Indo-Pacific. So what's different about it? Well, of course, the first thing is that the term Indo-Pacific, as Victor has mentioned, encompasses the Indian Ocean and by extension, the Indian subcontinent, as well as the vast reaches of the Pacific. Its geographic boundaries extend, depending on who you're talking to the east coast, to the coast of East Africa and the island of Madagascar, or perhaps just the Indian Ocean and the large US naval air base at Diego Suarez in its center, or to the littoral states of the Indian subcontinent and even the Persian Gulf. The geographic definition tends to depend on who is doing the defining. India considers the definition to include the entire Indian Ocean and all its bordering states, including those in what we would call the Middle East. For the US, it's more of an ocean and sea lane security definition. Believe it or not, the French have their own Indo-Pacific definition. They, of course, have territories in both the Southern Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific. And their definition is more multilateral, based on peaceful resolution of disputes while protecting the sea lanes that they depend upon. Japan and Australia have their own ideas about what an Indo-Pacific strategy is. And in the US, of course, under the Trump administration, the concept of Indo-Pacific was seized upon and given the added dimension of free and open, spawning a new acronym that you may or may not have heard of, FOIP. And it's not freedom of information, it's free and open Indo-Pacific. So FOIP, seen from the perspective of the current US administration, is largely a China containment strategy. Even though the US State Department's policy paper on FOIP states specifically that it excludes no nation, it is very clear from the wording of the report that it is designed to counter Chinese expansion in areas ranging from economic development, such as the Belt and Road, to domination of sea lanes in the South China Sea. Now, Japan has its own free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which it has now rebranded as a vision, a somewhat less controversial term designed to mollify China, which has expressed concern that FOIP could become kind of an Asian NATO. Japan has focused its efforts on economic connectivity and inclusiveness rather than military exclusion. With regard to India, India has its own problems with China, as we know, both on its land borders and in the Indian Ocean, where China is challenging India's maritime supremacy in that sphere. Australia, for its part, is wary of being caught in the middle of a US-China confrontation, and as a regional middle power has worked hard to improve relations with its near neighbors. Yet Australia, like Japan, wants to keep the US engaged in the region, including militarily. Recently, the US, Japan, India, and Australia all participated in a high-level meeting in what's been termed the Asia-Pacific Quad. There have been many quads over the years. This is the Asia-Pacific Quad. It's a loose strategy of cooperation to maintain open sea lanes, build Indo-Pacific cooperation, and also, by the way, to conduct joint naval exercises. And there's yet one more definition of Indo-Pacific. In the center, straddling both oceans, lies ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, who see themselves as an integral part of the Indo-Pacific region, but yet want to resist being co-opted by the US in any confrontation with China, while still maintaining sufficient distance from Beijing to avoid becoming Chinese pawns in its competition with the United States. Now, in all this, Canada needs to figure out where its interests lie, what role it can play, and how it should position itself with respect to all these competing strategies and visions. What kind of Indo-Pacific strategy can and should Canada develop? There are many who will argue that given our close economic and strategic alignment with the US, we have no effective alternative but to become part of and contribute to Washington's FOIP strategy. However, I think that would be wrong. As important as the US is, we should avoid becoming an automatic junior partner to the US in the region. After all, Canada does not need to participate in a US-led Indo-Pacific strategy in order to deepen our bilateral relations with Australia, with India, with Japan, or with ASEAN. Canada's participation in the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, that mouthful with CPTPP, in which Japan, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Australia, and New Zealand are also members, along with Mexico, Chile, and Peru in Latin America, also provides us with our own foothold, one at the moment that the US does not enjoy. And frankly, should relations with China ever begin to get back on track, maintaining Canada's independence of action, separate from being a junior partner to the US in a US-led FOIP strategy, would allow Canada to develop a relationship with China somewhat independent of the vagaries of US-China relations. I don't see at this current juncture much happening, of course, on Canada-China relations, but China is always going to be there and needs to be reckoned with. And it's interesting that in recent days, China has once again expressed its interest in joining the CPTPP at some point in future. So to come back to Canada's IP strategy and to come to a conclusion, we are necessarily aligned militarily with the US, and our small but effective military assets need to continue to cooperate closely with US forces. However, at the same time, Canada needs to maintain its independence of action as a middle power, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. We can exercise leadership not only in pushing the remaining members of the CPTPP to ratify the agreement, but also proactively support CPTPP expansion and enlargement for interested and qualified trading partners such as Thailand, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, and South Korea, amongst others. Enlarging the CPTPP through the addition of leading ASEAN states will enhance Canada's market access and strategic influence and strengthen our relations with ASEAN. There's also the unfulfilled promise, of course, of Canada-India relations and potentially a Canada-ASEAN free trade agreement, which frankly, if we expanded the CPTPP, we may not need to to pursue. So in sum, as competing visions of what the Indo-Pacific is and what it means continue to evolve, Canada would be well advised to avoid any commitment to an exclusionary framework governing the Indo-Pacific, in my view. Instead, we should be finding ways to support a more inclusive vision that would include trade facilitation and respect of democratic values. And when I talk about democratic values, I don't mean necessarily Anglo-Saxon values, Australia, New Zealand. I mean broad democratic values, including the kind of democracies practiced in Japan and Indonesia and other parts of Asia. At the same time, we need to avoid being co-opted into an exclusionary, primarily, military-focused structure. So to use a Christmas metaphor, since we're in December, there are many, many ornaments we can hang on this tree, but what we need to do is figure out what kind of a tree it will be when we come to select it. I suggest that it's in Canada's interest to align ourselves with frameworks and visions, such as those espoused by Japan and ASEAN, which are more inclusive, while continuing, of course, to work with the US and watching for opportunities to reopen dialogue with China. At the same time, we should work to strengthen the CPTPP, Canada-ASEAN, and the Canada-India relations, and domestically continue to focus and build strong people-to-people relationships across the Indo-Pacific region through the continued application of a flexible and welcoming immigration policy focused on building and adding to Canada's needed skills. Thank you very much. I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks very much, Hugh, for doing such a great job of setting the stage and raising some of the important themes and issues, including the importance to Canada of developing an independent foreign policy, the inclusive approach that you're articulating. That's great. And let me just say how impressed I am at how quickly CPTPP rolls off your tongue. I find that just amazing. Anyway, thanks very much, Hugh, and let me move quickly now to Juan.
Thank you so much, Victor. I would like to start by giving thanks for the invitation to participate in this panel with distinguished leaders and experts. I believe that this event gives valuable evidence of the increasing importance of coming together to discuss our different perspectives on critical issues. And this opportunity is especially timely for that strategic relevance of analyzing Canada's global trading interest in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. The new reality produced by the global pandemic that we are all facing has modified all our planning and tested our resilience, our determination, and our commitment not only for free and open trade, but also for inclusive and collaborative solutions. The pandemic has negatively impacted the global economy and international trade to such an extent that the analytical projections are not encouraging at all. The International Monetary Fund, for instance, projects that the global output will drop by 4.4% for this year. The World Trade Organization expects that the volume of world merchandise trade contract by 9.2%, and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development projects global foreign direct investment flows will have a dramatic decrease by up to 40% in 2020. Likewise, Canadian forecasts for this year are not encouraging either, with a GDP expected to drop by 7.1% and exports and imports estimated to decrease by 8.3% and 10.7% respectively. In this context of uncertainty and challenges in both the Canadian and global economies, analyzing all trade options available, including the Indo-Pacific, is an essential exercise for Canada that could contribute to boosting his economy and deepen his bonds in the region. Canada is a trading nation with over 45,000 companies that export products and with over 165,000 businesses that import goods. Therefore, it's imperative to protect those jobs and businesses and offer new opportunities for Canadian business by setting an effective approach to engage with the Indo-Pacific area where most high-growth economies are located. To be noted, as Hugh already said, there are several nations that have already identified the value of position itself as active players of an Indo-Pacific vision. In this context, I would like to share with you two reasons why I consider Canada should seriously consider drafting and implementing an Indo-Pacific approach as a strategic trade policy, and 2 challenges that Canada should consider when moving forward. The fifth reason to support the Indo-Pacific approach by Canada is the imperative needed to diversify its trade. Official reports point out that Canada's exports are the 4th most concentrated by destination out of 113 economies. This is true due to a large share of exports going to the US market. Whether the global economy is uncertain or stable, having diverse market destinations available to export to can assist Canadian companies prosper by taking advantage of dynamic economies and minimizing risks. In this regard, formal engagement with the Indo-Pacific could represent new alternatives for businesses, including small and business enterprises, to export their products and services and engage in regional supply chains. The great news is that Canada would not have to start from zero. These efforts have already been advanced in trade relationships in the region via free trade agreements. And in order to be successful, the key step is this diversification imperative is that Canada takes a more proactive role in trade agreements where it's already a member, and also in those that are currently in the negotiation stage. In this sense, the CPTPP agreement, as already Hugh mentioned as well, represent a unique opportunity to diversify Canada's trade with 7 economies with which Canada didn't have an FTA before. The opportunity to diversify Canada's trade through the CPTPP could be expanded if Canada uses this trade pact as a platform to strengthen its economic foothold in the region and open new markets by advocating for other countries to join the agreement. 3 agreements in the negotiation stage that might represent important milestones in Canada's intention to diversify its trade are those with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, India, and Mercosur. However, it must be highlighted that reaching an agreement in these 3 eventual FTAs will not be easy at all, because there are several sensitive issues and sectors that need to be negotiated among the parties. In order to close these 3 trade deals, Canada will need use of all its trade and negotiating expertise, and an Indo-Pacific approach might contribute to this engagement more effectively. The second reason to support an Indo-Pacific approach by Canada is consolidating their trade relations with current trading partners. Canada needs to promote and ensure that its business people are reaching the full potential in trade and investments opportunities. To reach this full potential, Canada has to take better advantage of his 14 free trade agreements in force that gives Canadian business access to 1.5 billion consumers across 51 economies. And particularly in the Indo-Pacific, Canada currently has, via FTAs, access to 13 dynamic economies, which could complement his economy perfectly. In order to consolidate these ties, Canada needs to tap the benefits of its membership in each of its trade agreements, but with special attention to the CPTPP, CUSMA, and eventually the Pacific Alliance. For these 2 reasons, if Canada is serious about the necessity of diversification and consolidation of trade, Canada needs to commit itself to a mid-term and long-term action plan, aiming to create strengthened relations with the Indo-Pacific countries, supported by a strategic vision. On the other hand, 2 challenges that Canada could face in the process of the construction of this Indo-Pacific approach are the following. First, some of the vision already expressed for some countries are opposite to Canada's values. Therefore, the challenge for Canada is to clearly define a vision that represents Canada's principles and his legitimate interest, and offer a compelling value proposition for the Indo-Pacific. Canada has characterized their commitment with multilateralism and by championing an international order based on recognized standards and rules. In this respect, the Indo-Pacific represents an ideal space to ratify Canada's commitment with the international order and promote Canada values based on cooperation, inclusivity, and institutionalism. A second challenge that is that Canada might face in the region is the fact that there is diverse and large in geography, including any countries across the India and Pacific Oceans, according to some definitions. And for this reason, Canada's approach must prioritize markets that can leverage economic recovery in a post-COVID stage and increase trade and investment presence of Canadian businesses in regional supply chains. In this respect, Canada should operate selectively in the Indo-Pacific rather than adopting a region-wide approach by defining carefully his priority markets, his initiatives and engagement to support and participate in. To overcome this challenge of the large capacity of the Indo-Pacific, Canada should also join efforts and work together with like-minded economies in the region to find solutions together for common trade and investment issues that require attention in the face of protectionism and unilateral measures. Canada's formal engagement with the Indo-Pacific might support global efforts not only to defend the international trading system, and particularly the WTO, but to improve it as well. The Indo-Pacific opportunity fits perfectly with the words mentioned recently by Honorable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during an international meeting with business leaders, when he said, "This is Canada's moment to lead," and he invited them to lead with Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, building a solid presence from Canada in the Indo-Pacific is not something that will happen by accident. This is an important decision for Canada's future, and it demands a collective effort. It's time for Canada to define a comprehensive and cohesive Indo-Pacific approach, which could play a meaningful role not only for his own economy, but also contribute to the trade architecture of the region. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Juan, for that excellent talk. I think you did a great job of stressing the importance of an engagement, a deliberate and cohesive engagement with the region, in part as a response to the challenges of the pandemic. So thanks very much for that important point. And with that, let me turn the virtual floor, over to Brian.
Very good. Thanks, Victor. And I, like the others, am honored to be on this panel to talk about, my role is to talk a little bit more about India in depth. And as Juan and Hugh have said, Canada needs to engage in the Indo-Pacific, in my view, and obviously India being a large part of the Indo in the Indo-Pacific should be among our top considerations, especially as and if we wish to pivot our trade to diversify away from the United States and China. But in order to do this, we really have to understand what we would be faced with. And to do this, we have to understand a little bit more about modern India in a more in-depth way. So to try and understand modern India, one has to be aware of its colonial past and even further back to the Mughal empires and princely states, and of course its ethnicity and religious makeup. This isn't something I can do in 10 minutes, and really you have to be born in India to understand this. So suffice it to say, though, that partition and India's independence in 1947 continue to impact modern India today. The Brits weren't great at determining boundaries, but they did leave the lasting legacy of democracy. And it's the boundaries in the north of India that are a significant issue, and I'll come to that in a little bit more. India is a big country. It's the 7th largest. It's 1/3 the size of Canada, but it's still the 7th largest. It has an enormous population, of course, of 1.38 billion people, soon to pass, according to the United Nations, China in not so long away, 2027, it will become the most populous nation in the world. It has aspirations to be a global player, both economically and geopolitically. It's the largest economy and most populous in South Asia. And so with Prime Minister Modi, it definitely is taking that leadership role in at least in South Asia and probably beyond. India aspires to be a counterbalance to China. Hugh talked about the Indian Ocean, and I'll come to that in a moment, in the region, and to protect its line of control, this de facto border between China, India, and Pakistan. India also keeps a keen eye on Nepal and Bhutan, the two mice between two elephants, and the Indian states in the northeast of India, one of which, Arunachal Pradesh, is claimed by China as they see it as a part of South Tibet, and therefore theirs as a result of their takeover of Tibet. Obviously, water and hydro are the key issues at play in this somewhat difficult region. So there remain numerous challenges to touch on a few. The line of control, as I mentioned, between India, Pakistan, and China will continue to be a national security issue. Kashmir is a simmering pot of discontent, and Modi's Hindu-centric BJP party has recently stirred that pot with its recent change to Kashmir and Jammu's status in India. China, aligned with Pakistan and with its eye on water resources in the Himalayas, continues to push its interests with strong military presence along their portion of the line of control, and we've seen flare-ups of that in the recent times. The Belt and Road Initiative, which has been already been mentioned, is they want to see a land link with Pakistan through Kashmir, and they have also virtually built Sri Lanka's advanced infrastructure in India's closest island neighbor. India is a huge importer of oil from the Middle East and African countries, and in this regard, it maintains its non-aligned status to purchase freely. However, it also competes with China in this region and in this regard, and one might suggest that the Indian Ocean is China's sweet spot when it comes to oil traffic. So as Hugh has mentioned, a lot of reasons for Canada to watch this, but not necessarily align itself with the United States. Domestically, national security issues and China's continued aggressive approach in the region are driving India to upgrade its defense, its military, and spending in that area is now 2.4% of GDP, and it's on the rise in real terms. Despite India being having a GDP growth spurt in recent years, topping all other countries, COVID is hitting the economy hard. GDP growth will surely decline, and some are suggesting negative growth rates going forward from almost 7% in 2019. That's a bit of a hard fall. Modi's reforms such as GST to streamline taxation, revisions to bankruptcy law, Make in India are all paying dividends, or were before COVID hit, and it'll be an enormous challenge to get India back on track. And frankly, India is way behind on climate change, with 75% of its total energy produced by fossil fuels. And in terms of electricity generation, coal, and it is not clean coal, make up 70-75% of electricity. And obviously daily pollution rates in major cities are atrocious. Infrastructure remains poor, challenging India's economy. It's ranked 70th out of 100 on Statist's infrastructure ranking study in 2019, whereas Canada was 26 and China was 36. Finally, as has been mentioned, China's Belt and Road is cutting through their neighborhood, and it's a tremendous amount of skepticism within foreign affairs in India. They fear the financial challenges of small countries getting too far into debt with China. Now I better move to Canada's relationship with India. We've gone through a number of ups and downs, but what has been a constant and what really binds us is the 1 million India diaspora in Canada. Indo-Canadian students, landed immigrants, etc. This is a strong cadre of people who have strong ties to India and what brings us together mostly. Our relations have soured after India's nuclear test, as we know, in '74, but they've been going up and down ever since. And in 2012, with PM Harper's visit to India, things started to warm up. We talked about free trade agreements, we talked about investment agreements, and we've moved those along. Unfortunately, the Trudeau visit didn't particularly pay dividends, and those agreements are now back on the shelf gathering dust. So let's quickly look at our trade and investment with India. I know I don't have a lot of time, But you think with a population of 1.38 billion people, there would be a huge market in India. It's a growing middle class, but don't forget that GDPs, while our GDPs are comparable on a per capita basis, India's GDP is about 15 times lower than Canada's. And there's still 50 to 60 million Indians that are in poverty, below the poverty line. China has slipped to second place. The United States is now its largest trading partner. Canada is now ninth trading. India is now Canada's ninth largest trading partner and has increased on an annual basis by about 13% over 10 years, but this is coming at a very low level. Our trade with India has suffered as a result of COVID. We're down about 23%. As I say, Canada and India's trade has gone up by 13%. Our total world average is only 5%. But our exports to India are from a low base. 2019 was a record number of exports to India with 4.8 billion in exports, but this just represents over 1% of our trade with the United States. Furthermore, our exports largely are resource products, and 70% are resource products and 10% are agricultural. India is a difficult place. We've tried to do free trade agreements and investment agreements with India while I was based in India, but those are we just could not really get over the line on that. So I think trade will continue with India, but it will be on Indian terms, and we're going to have to recover our trade from the COVID numbers that has really hit us. So where does this leave us? This, I think, leaves us with investment. It leaves us with services. Indian tourism was starting to rise pre-COVID. And service industries such as engineering services are needed in India. So services on the trade side and investment, both two-way investment. Canadian pension funds are investing about 63 billion, have about 63 billion invested in India right now. The big guys like Tata, Aditya Birla, Jubilant, some of these big companies are heavily invested in Canada with a view to gaining access to the US market for sure, but certainly there is much more growth to be had in the region, and particularly with India in the investment space. I think my time is up, Victor, so I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Brian, both for giving us a great overview of India, contemporary India, actually some of the history as well, and some of the contemporary challenges, including water, hydro, climate, the BRI, Kashmir, a line of control. That's all very helpful. And also for situating Canada's trade relationship with India and your suggestions that we focus on investment and services. So thanks very much. That's all very helpful. So with that, let's turn to Phil now. Phil,
thanks,
over
Victor,
to you.
and thanks, Victor, and thanks to. It's a great honor to be here as to be with all this distinguished panel. I want to thank Mallin and Chris as well for all the work done in hosting and putting together this panel. I wanted to take in my time allotted talk about two broad issues, and we're talking about the concept of Indo-Pacific, and as you mentioned earlier, it starts in a lot of ways as a security concept, and now we're looking at it, and a number of people looking at it as also a commercial concept, diversifying away from China and diversifying our trade in the region as a kind of a counterbalance. And so I wanted to first of all talk about some broad trends in the region, what I think to kind of contextualize things. I'm going to step back and maybe look a bit farther ahead on this, because I think that helps us sort of think about how Canada positions itself as in the region going forward. And then I'll talk a little bit about diversification and this term that's thrown around a lot, and people have different definitions of it. So I want to have a bit of a talk about that. So some key trends in the region, and this is a very diverse region, Indo-Pacific. So we have to recognize that when we talk about Indo-Pacific, we're talking about a great difference among the different countries in terms of levels of prosperity, governance, et cetera, et cetera. But what I think some trends we should be thinking about over the next decade as we look at this region, and the first is a good reason to be focusing on it. And the whole Indo-Pacific region, including China, the whole region, is where the center of economic gravity is shifting in the world. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Before COVID hit, before the pandemic hit, the predictions we're looking at by 2030, India being the third largest country in GDP terms, third largest economy in GDP terms, with Asia-Pacific expecting to account for 45% of global GDP and 63% of global growth. And during this period, also looking at a slower growth in China as China's economy matures and changes to about an average annual growth rate of about 4% by the end of the decade. And in particular, some economic dynamism in South Asia and countries like Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam, as these countries rise in sort of the ranking of economic size in the world, and European countries start slipping down. That's the way things are headed. Now, COVID had a tremendous impact, as Juan has mentioned, on the region, and I don't think we've really been able to assess it, as we're still in the middle of it in terms of what the overall impact will be. But according to World Bank's latest studies, in the shorter term, certainly we're looking at it for the first time in Asia Pacific, in East Asia, East Asia, we're looking at increased poverty. Across the region, we're looking at increased fiscal pressure on governments, indebtedness, support to people and businesses, lots of concerns about prospects for inclusive long-term growth, and a long-term effect on human capital, learning and job access, etc. So these are unknowns. These are things that are kind of slowing down the growth, not only in Asia, but around the world, but this is hitting the region. So whether these calculations have an impact in the long term on where things will end up in 2030 from an order perspective, I don't know. I don't think so. I think we're still headed in that direction. I think the center of gravity will continue to be in Asia, especially as China has recovered and their economy seems to be looking for better growth prospects next year at about 7%, and East Asia as well. India, as Brian mentioned, the drop is substantial this year, but has potential to rebound next year, depending on who the analysts are, what analyst is talking about it. So you know, and this dynamism in the region, as Juan mentioned, is also a dynamism in trade agreements. And we think about this is the only region where really there's significant action on trade agreements, new trade agreements happening. Sure, we had the Canada, US, Mexico agreement, but that was really a rehash of NAFTA. But here we have CPTPP, and we have RCEP. And RCEP is seen to be less ambitious. I'll get back to that a bit later. But in a period when other protectionism is gaining ground in a lot of other areas and a lot of other regions, and when there's a great skepticism about international trade agreements, these countries are moving forward with these. And I think that's a significant importance to us. Also, I think we're going to be seeing increased integration, continued increased economic integration in the region, maybe not in East Asia particularly. India is not part of any of these agreements yet, and I think that's a shame, because I think that integration could also, it could help advance the kind of integration that's taking place. Just another trend I want to mention briefly is demographics. Between now and 2030, by 2030, about 17% of Asia's population will be over 60. What we're seeing is, on one hand, a number of aging populations like Canada, or China, Japan, Thailand. China over 60 population will be about 25% by 2030. And Japan will be 32%, and you know, some above average. On the other hand, you're going to have countries where the working age population, as you might want to put, the younger population, is growing significantly. We're talking India, Indonesia, the Philippines. So on the one hand, you're having one set of countries who are facing these kind of the demographic challenge of an aging population, how they manage that, and that dictates or should inform how we approach these countries, how Canadian companies approach these countries. The older aging countries are looking at knowledge industries, new technologies, of course, things like elder care, all sorts of other aspects of it. Whereas the working age population, countries with a growing working age population, have the workforce to participate and support continued growth in manufacturing sector with the proper investment. But this investment in the region, but also investment in education, vocational training, and all those kinds of skills that one has to have to participate in the sector. So that's so there's sort of another demographic challenge we're facing, but we have to understand that the demographics are different in different parts of the region, but there are significant changes happening. And then as part of a demographic shift, we're looking at urbanization as well. And this is something I think is particularly important in the region. By 2030, according to projections, and of course projections are always sometimes difficult to not necessarily bear out the way they're originally are thought to be, but let's look at by 2030, we're looking at, say, 950 million and 600 million urban populations in China and India, respectively. And an additional 100 million people in urban areas in Southeast Asia, making the total urban population of Southeast Asia about 370 million people. So different urbanization levels in different countries, but this is a trend that's happening, and that has a tremendous implications for how we approach the region. So in the rapidly, and you know, China has actually been addressing this urbanization. They have put a lot of work into smart cities and urban development. I think that's very important, and there are lessons actually all of us can take from that in terms of how some of the way cities are managed, but in their larger cities. But in the other parts of Asia, they're going to be facing tremendous challenges in South and Southeast Asia. Particularly, you're talking about housing, education, healthcare, sanitation, transportation, other public amenities, and of course, energy. Energy demands are going to be profound of this urbanization. And without significant investment in renewable energy, Brian Parrott mentioned already the level of pollution in India, you're going to have a tremendous environmental impact. And of course, for the countries looking at, like Laos, looking at using hydro to sort of advance their own economies, be kind of the battery of Southeast Asia, as they call themselves. But that has tremendous impacts on water biodiversity, water management, because there are already significant problems with that, depending on how you manage your dams. And the last sort of big issue I want to talk about is actually water management and climate change, because climate change isn't on the agenda for a lot of countries in the region. But what we're going to be seeing not only are increased disasters, so extreme weather events and climate migration, which are huge challenges, but also water competition. We're going to, as the glaciers in the Tibetan Plateau melt and the melting accelerates, you're looking at first more flooding along the rivers all through Asia that are fed by these glaciers, and then drought, dryness, water competition. This is significant, not only in geopolitical terms, but also in how we approach the region. So, and in that sense, maybe if you want to look at what this tells us in sort of kinds of what will be in long-term interest in these regions are urban management skills, all the kinds of technologies of running cities, energy efficiency, water management, hydropower, which we used to do extensively abroad. These sorts of issues are things that are sectors, are things that are going to be of great interest. And now I'm going to very quickly turn to the issue of diversification. And Juan mentioned it, and I think we talk about it a lot, and that's very important. I think diversification has two meanings from two different observers of China, especially. And one is the context in which Juan was talking about it, which is expansion of our commercial interests in the region, beyond just having this focus on China. There is a sense that we are dependent, Canada is dependent on China's exports to, is export dependent. And this is actually an internal region in Canada, because, or internal regional issue in Canada, because if you look at it, talk of people, the federal government, people looking at this, talk about China only really being 4 to 5% of Canadian exports. So, we're not that dependent. But, us sitting out here in Western Canada, we know that we're talking more about 15% dependency, and sometimes entire sectors in Western Canada are dependent on the China market. So this is significant. So the idea of diversifying away from this is, perhaps, would perhaps reduce this kind of dependency on China. But I think we have to realize the reality is that governments don't diversify trade. The private sector diversifies trade. It's the private sector that makes these decisions. And often the people in the private sector who decide about where they're going to go and where their markets are, this isn't something that happens in the short term. This is a long-term, difficult process of making new contacts, making new arrangements, new market studies, et cetera. And the government's job is going to be to support this. If this is the direction we're going to go, it will take some domestic support to do this. It'll take education. It'll take making a greater awareness of international markets. And frankly, China is an extremely important market for Canada, and the level of competence in China is abysmally low in the world. So there will have to be investment in raising this capacity as well, and in trade agreements. And Juan has talked very, very, I think, eloquently about the CPTPP and its importance, and the possibility of expanding the CPTPP to India, which would be excellent. Also, Thailand, Taiwan, etc. China's expressed interest in the CPTPP is interesting, and we could have a long conversation about that. I'm not sure whether it's just a gambit as a new US president comes into place, and whether it's a little a gauntlet being thrown down, or a nudge or a push. I have trouble seeing China going through an accession process, because they went through the WTO process, and I don't think they ever want to do that again. So what exactly that means is going to be, would have an impact on the measures of the TPP, the CPTPP itself. The other thing we should think about is RCEP itself. It's just been signed. And if you talk to, there's few of it, but I'm an old trade policy person. I spent some time there, and the standard response to things like RCEP is, agreements like RCEP is, well, it's not very high value, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like CPTPP, but the fact is that it does cover 30% of global GDP. It increases market access within this group. And frankly, it might be faster to join RCEP than to actually negotiate a bilateral agreement with ASEAN, which is where most of our gain would be in RCEP. So that's as well, of course, as with China. So that's kind of my diversification. I wanted to talk about supply chain diversification, but I think, Victor, my time is up. So I'll pass it on. I'll pass on, but just to say, supply chain diversification is a very complicated and very difficult thing to try to undertake. And so China is probably the only country that has the capacity to do in Asia what can be done right now. But I'll leave that to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. And yes, I hope we can come back to that in the discussion. I think that was a really helpful setting out of some of the issues, both in terms of the challenges, and you spoke of the demographic and ecological challenges in particular, and connecting those challenges. You mentioned urbanization and the need for clean energy and housing, and the pressures on water, connecting those concerns to some of the opportunities related to trade and diversification. So thanks very much for linking those sets of concerns and opportunities. Let me leave it at that and turn the floor over to Margaret. I think you have to unmute.
It's a pleasure to be speaking here today. My role here is to focus on China and the Canadian interest in China. There's obviously a significant body of opinion in Canada that rejects the improvement of trade and investment relations with China and urges diversification of the trade, or diversion of trade, to other partners to ensure Canada avoids influence or bullying. I quote Andrew Coyne from a week ago, Saturday's Globe and Mail: "Geopolitical theories of the rise of China as a global hegemon die hard, as does liberal and Trudeauvian naivete about communist dictatorships, especially as these coincide with the business interests of retired liberal grandees." Now, of course, we have to make allowances for this being newspaper reporting, but nonetheless, this conflation, or the need to characterize Canadian economic interests as personal interests or the interests of some clique or group, is, rather than national interest of Canada, is, I think, very revealing. Canada is heavily dependent on trade. The economic world in which we trade has changed drastically. China and East Asia are expected to generate the lion's share of global GDP as we've heard, with a rising percentage share of middle class over the coming decade. China will overtake the US in absolute market size, in absolute dollars, and in some sectors will be not just the largest market, but the most advanced market before 2030. South Asia and India, specifically India, are going to click in, but they're going to click in later. Our immediate focus should be on East Asia. Post-pandemic, Canada is going to struggle. Canadian exports to the US will be directly hit by Buy America, protectionist measures of all sorts, and government procurement priorities. Protectionist measures to which the Biden administration is firmly committed. I don't think there's really much flexibility that Mr. Biden has in these policies. The continentalist argument that we should be just focused north-south, I think has been revealed or is going to be revealed as particularly damaging to our national interest. China's post-pandemic recovery has been rapid and robust. I think focusing on demographic changes, et cetera, in the immediate term, in the next decade, China is just overwhelmingly significantly the growth market of Asia and of the world. For instance, in September 2020, the year to date, China's imports of Canadian goods are up 5%, whereas our exports to the United States are down 20%. And with respect to Australia, which has a bitter trade fight, their Australian exports to China are up 5% over the year. So meanwhile, the American and EU markets are recovering much more slowly and they are going to face a very significant pandemic debt. Generating robust exports to China and East Asia is going to be vital to maintaining Canada's current standard of living in the coming years. This may not be a popular insight, but it's a critical economic analysis. Leading edge Canadian producers and service providers sell internationally without much help, but Canadian government support, government exporter support is necessary for the average, or not average isn't the right word, but for the general exporter support and success in Asia. The notion that Canada should try to avoid China or expect that other Asian markets can replace China demand in either the short or longer term is not really rooted in the realm of the possible. Neither people nor countries need to be friends to trade, but active hostility is not helpful either, as witnessed by the current China-Australia trade war. It began with Australia proposing an international investigation into the origins of COVID outbreak in China. Now, the Chinese argue that they didn't delay after they knew what it was, but regardless of this, there's a certain parallel between Australia and Canada, Australia with respect to China, Canada with respect to the United States. While we see the Chinese behavior versus Australia as influence, highly negative influence, it's useful sometimes to put the shoe on the other foot. If Canada started to launch an international investigation into the American management of the COVID pandemic and its negative effects on Canada, and then lobbed in a few critiques of American policies and race relations, it might be interesting what kind of response we'd have back from the United States. So I think it's always useful to see things in a broader perspective. On supply chains, Canadians are secondary and tertiary members of such chains and not in a position to dictate terms or create alternative cost-effective chains. Even in the short term, restricting Canadian companies to US and friendly country only chains is just not in our interest, whatever. RCEPs acceleration of regional integration creates headwinds for the US effort to separate China from regional and global supply chains, which is fortunate for Canadian companies. RCEP deepens China's position in the key engine of Asian integration. It also does something to it also does something to, as I say, sideline. The RCEP includes provisions governing e-commerce, government procurement, non-localization of data, intellectual property rights in excess of WTO. The challenges the US, and which these all challenge the United States claims that China is flagrantly out of step with international trade norms. Whether, I guess there are people who don't think they'll live up to their RCEP undertakings, but I don't think that's the most likely. What we, on the contrary, with the proliferation of regional consultative and trade groups in Asia, of which we're not a member other than CPTPP and APEC, although marginally, it's Canada that risks being regulated further to the sidelines. RCEP, as Phil mentioned, represents 1/3 of the world's trade. So neither Canada or the US are members. Canada competes directly with East Asia, in East Asia with Australia and New Zealand. And it's no wonder that the United States prefers managed trade rather than competitive trade in the form of their US-China trade deal, phase 1. I think there are people who feel that this is going to be changed radically by Mr. Biden, and I think it's worth seeing. Maybe it will be. At present, Canada is close to maintaining a minimal economic engagement in East Asia rather than a robust one. The region is evolving a new order which of necessity must integrate the interests of China and the other Asian players. So with the possible exception of Japan, the issue as seen in Asia is about adjusting and mitigating the role of China, not minimizing or isolating China as seen from Washington. As evidence of this, Yves Terbigan at UBC's noted the real major uptick in informal consultations on global issues amongst ASEAN countries, ASEAN and the 3 and the 5. The 3 being Japan, South Korea, and Japan, South Korea, and sorry, who's the third? In any event, given the global significance of South Korea, Japan, and Australia, Indonesia, Canada has a global incentive to join the constructive regional collaboration on pandemic early warning system, pandemic management, vaccine distribution, etc., as well as building sustainable growth and climate change consensus. In line with the economic dynamism of East Asia, these countries are advancing in global terms, and it could be argued that Canada is falling behind for not taking sufficiently active role in East Asia. I don't know if my time is coming to an end, but let's move.
I think you have a couple more minutes if you want to wrap up.
All right. I would say one of the major difficulties of turning to East Asia is the cost involved in building multi-country competence. There's pragmatic pressure to select the important few, namely the leading democracies. This would be ineffective, in my view, as the underlying issues for Canada are economic and wide-ranging across East Asia, from South Korea to Vietnam to Singapore. It would merely cement the impression of our close alignment with US security policy, alienating ASEAN and China. What secondary powers value is trade and investment links and constructive participation in regional governance and security, not a country strongly engaged on one side. Time will tell. The Canadian position might be simply to listen to the views and watch the actions of the leading countries, those that will be most affected by any brewing Cold War.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that was a wonderful sort of capstone to our discussion, and a bit of a skeptical note, if I might say. I mean, we started with a focus on the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and Phil, for instance, his view of that being the center of economic gravity, and Margaret, I think you did very well at sort of pulling us back into East Asia, and with a claim that China is too big and too important to ignore, if I might put words in your mouth. So I wonder if I could use your terrific provocation to go back to the other panelists and ask for their response, because what I'm hearing from you, and I'll let you sort of come in at the end of this to maybe correct or redirect. But what I'm hearing is that maybe the Indo-Pacific is not as important as our first few panelists maybe have been hinting. So with that provocation, could I put it back to our earlier panelists? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump
yes,
in.
Hugh, go ahead.
Well, I would say I fully agree with Margaret when she says that China is going to continue to be important to Canada. It's one thing to talk about, well, we're going to reshore all this stuff and we're going to get rid of all these supply chains and so on, and alter them. And in fact, and I think it was Phil that made the point, it's business that does this rather than government. China is going to continue to be important, and notwithstanding the fact that China's popularity in Canada is at an all-time low and there are major significant bilateral issues, we're going to have to find a way. The word engagement is very unpopular, but I mean, to continue to do business or deal with China, perhaps that's the way of putting it. I don't think, though, that rules out attempts at greater diversification. Whether we want to have an Indo-Pacific strategy or not, other countries are doing it. And so, frankly, we do need to figure out how we position ourselves. And China's part of the Indo-Pacific too. So I'm not saying that in fact, my point is that our Indo-Pacific strategy should not be a China containment strategy. It should include engagement or re-engagement with China and figuring out our relationship with China. But it also needs to have a second leg to the stool. And that second leg is to build our relations with Japan in particular, with ASEAN, and including India, even though, as Brian has pointed out, the economic returns may be, somewhat minimal for quite some time.
Yeah, and in my defense of my assertion, I did say that Asia would be the center of gravity, not Indo-Pacific. So that
point taken. Thanks, Phil. Brian, over to you, and then to Juan.
I just wanted to, maybe this doesn't go to the Indo-Pacific issue, but I just wanted to remind everybody that Canada has been talking about diversifying away from the United States in particular for 25 years at least, or 20, whatever. We've signed this new USMCA agreement, which Trump told us we were taking advantage of the Americas. But if we actually look at the trade numbers, despite the talk, we still trade 75% of our stuff goes to the United States. And in the years that Trump has been in election, under the Trump administration, our exports to the United States grew despite aluminum tariffs and other things, but our exports actually grew to the United States during his tenure. I know that Phil is absolutely right. The private sector determines who trades where and where they go, and they'll go where they go, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, free trade agreements help. They create a perception that there's a safety net there to some extent, and they do help if people take advantage of them. But we have to remember that we are beholden to the United States, and it's not such a bad thing, because not only is it our biggest trading partner, and it's a consistent trading partner of 75%, as I said, it's where we send most of our value-added stuff. You look at the numbers, oil still is the #1 export to the United States. Electricity is another export to the United States, but it's also a huge consumer of our manufactured goods that support like autos and aircraft and parts and blah, 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 blah. Whereas the rest of our countries, what we sell to China is what they need, which is our resources. What we sell to India is what they need, which is our resources. We're not going to go and sell hundreds and hundreds of aircraft engines to China or India because they compete with us. We can invest there and partner with them and grow our business that way, which is my point. But with this diversification thing, yeah, it's great to diversify, but let's not forget. And the other point is, we talk about investing in Canada so you can gain access to the North American market. So we shoot ourselves in the foot. We say we're going to diversify from the Americans, but then we say, well, come and invest in Canada so you can sell your stuff to the Americans. So, you know.
Juan, can I invite you in on this discussion, diversification? Do you,
Yes.
I'm hearing that this is a sort of an ideal, but practically we're not going to be able to implement it. Is that your view?
Yes, I'm also my view. I think that in the case of China, Canada must keep itself away from Indo-Pacific visions that have as a goal the containment of China's rise and influence in the region. And in this point, I'm with all those that propose that rather than engage in power competition and confrontation with China or any other nation in the region, Canada must state an approach based on cooperation, inclusivity. And also I would like to add some comments about the US because it's a very interesting relationship. I also agree with Brian. Even though there is a high concentration of Canadian exports to the US, my advice and my opinion will be using this market via CUSMA as a stepping stone to overseas markets. So which means continuing doing business with the US while utilizing this as a platform to grow business in other markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Juan. I see we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to invite Chris to come back in and relay them to us.
Victor, panelists, we've had a couple of questions come in on Japan, which I'll combine together. They come from Gerald and Cam. The first issue, of course, is Japan's population we know is aging. It may create challenges for them in the future, but perhaps not right now. But we haven't actually talked about Japan too much. We have a great partnership with them, trade, tourism, resources, even militarily. We're beginning to cooperate with Japan much more closely. So where do you think that relationship is going to go with Japan? Can I, let's see, who is dealing with Japan? I don't have my Japan expert here because we are going to do a deep dive with Jeff Kacharski on Japan
Sure.
in the near future.
Well,
Margaret, maybe we could put Margaret on the spot, and then Phil, I think, is going to jump in here. Margaret, you were talking about East Asia a bit, and it seems to me that was part of what you were trying to suggest is greater engagement.
Greater
with
engagement with, yes, with
Japan.
with China and East Asia generally, but I must say I wouldn't be your Japan expert. What about Steve?
In general, I mean, I can just say I agree that we could always be doing more with Japan. I mean, I'm old enough as a trade commissioner to joining when Japan was the thing in Asia, and that was that was where we were going. That was an important, key important market that was growing while we were keeping our cars out, and that was another story. We often overlook Japan. I think the private sector overlooks Japan. I think politically, for a lot of years, China was the story, and people would fly over, Tokyo to land in Beijing. And the reality is Japan has an economy that, sure, there are certain measures about it. And Brian worked in Japan, I think, didn't you, Brian?
Yes.
And so you know more about it than I do, so I should stop talking. But anyway, that there is, from a security point of view, we have a security agreement with them. We signed in 2009. We could do a lot more there. But it is really, I think there's a lot more that could be done there. And it's a country that has, based on rule of law, which is a good basis for contractual agreements. Sorry, Brian, you should say more about it.
I don't have Hugh's capacity to ramble off the initials of the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement, but we're in it with Japan,
yeah.
And we should be taking advantage of it for sure. And we have tremendous first of all, I have tremendously good relations with Japan. And it's a known market to Canada. We've sent lots and lots of lumber and wood and coal and iron ore and copper ore and concentrates and all of our resources. And Japan's heavily invested in Canada. So there's lots we can do to piggyback off their investments in Canada and look at Canadian investment. Canadian investment in Japan is pretty low, but there are a number of trading lines and things that we have tremendously good relations with companies like Toyota, et cetera. So, and all the trading companies, they all are keen on Canada. But, you know, I mean, it's an aging population, and demographics, as Phil points out, is critically important.
Could I just address that
Yeah,
point?
please, go ahead.
I know the question was about demographics. And, you know, let's not forget that Japan is still the world's third largest economy. And, you know, you get this story of the demographics. I mean, I'm not denying that Japan is probably one of the oldest societies and so on. But it's, you know, you almost get the impression it's the sick man of Asia because you hear these stories. You know, there are ways of dealing with this. The Japanese could certainly do better in terms of, you know, immigration, but they have brought in significant numbers of guest workers. They're working on robotics, they're doing all sorts of things. So I think the story that, you know, Japan's the best days are behind it are a little exaggerated. I agree with Brian. It's a fantastic market. It's a market that's open and friendly to us. I think it's an area there we could definitely do more on. And of course, it was because of Japan that the TPP stayed alive and has been revived. They've had their arm twisted very severely by Mr. Trump, but they are multilateralists. So I think that a big part of Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy is to work more closely with Japan and get tighter with Japan, not to be anti-China, but simply to broaden our relationship and take advantage of what is already a very strong relationship, and in fact could be much better.
Thank you. Thanks, Hugh. Juan, anything before we turn back to Chris for more questions?
Yes, thank you. I would like to just to add that for me, Japan will be not in the first or in the first places of the like-minded economies that Canada can work together. I think that there are a lot of similarities in the interest to improving the international trading system, and they can perfectly work together in trying to improve rules in cross-border trade and services in the Indo-Pacific, trying to increase in participation of SMEs, promoting resilience in global supply chains. I think that they share on maybe several topics in the agenda that could be work together. So.
Great. Thanks, Juan. Chris, can I turn it back to you?
Yes, Victor, I have a question here that ties into a talk that we have coming up in the next few days with John Stackhouse, talking about Canada, Planet Canada, and our expats overseas. And we do know that immigrants coming to Canada, the #1 country, of course, is India, China, many coming from the Indo-Pacific region. The question really pertains to, you know, immigration isn't a one-way street where people just come here. How are we leveraging our expats back in the region to improve our trade opportunities? Do we have any examples of where Canada is really making a difference? I read an article today that said there were 89 high schools in China that have a Canadian curriculum. So would the panelists be able to talk to where they see Canada leveraging our immigrants who are going back out, let's say?
And let me just add to that, if anyone wants to just sort of chip in by giving us a sense of the landscape of where Canadians are concentrated, Canadian expats are concentrated in the region, that might be a good starting point. I mean, certainly there's a large concentration in Hong Kong. That I think everybody is aware of that now, especially since it's been in the news, but also the 16 years I spent in Singapore, there's a huge Canadian community, including Canada ASEAN Business Association has a base there, and certainly in other parts of Southeast Asia and South Asia. Brian, you probably could speak to that.
Well, certainly in Japan, in India, I suspect in China as well, Phil, there, and in many ASEAN countries, there are Canadian business organizations. In India, it happens to be the Indian Chamber of Commerce, or ICBC, Business Council, the India-Canada Business Council. And I wouldn't say there are expats running it, but there are people that are friendly to Canada. And if Trudeau's visit to India and the number of Indo-Canadians that went back to India with him are an indication of how we can leverage the immigrants in Canada back in their home country or their ex-country, that's an opportunity. And I suspect that's an opportunity in China. And quite frankly, we've used that. I mean, you can look at Prem Watsa, for example. He's Indo-Canadian and is the CEO of Fairfax, or the founder of Fairfax, has had a huge interest in promoting India as a place to do business. So it doesn't quite answer the question. But.
No, I'm going to resist the temptation to take us into the role of universities, but I just want to flag that because, with the number of students that study here and then go back, I think that's another really important point of connection. But in any case, does anyone else want to come in on this? I'm conscious that we only have a few more minutes left. So
I was going to suggest we ask Juan, because he is from Mexico and he's been very active with the Canadian-Mexican business community. So we have an example right here of somebody who's actually providing that bridge between Canada and one of Canada's important trading partners, Mexico. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Juan, but I know you've got a lot of experience in this area.
Thank you, Hugh. Yes, I think there is a lot of opportunities there to try to connect immigrants that they are already in Canada, and they are trying actually to pursue some business projects, and then maybe they don't know how to start. Actually, I have been advising some Indian friends because they are trying to start here in Canada a business that with connection to India. So I think that Canada should articulate better these opportunities and try to facilitate, because there is a lot of knowledge and capabilities that they can take advantage. Also, I think that there is a gap in the training and in improving the skills to go abroad. I think Canada should promote more programs to learn another languages. So, but from coast to coast. I think if we were talking about the possibility of an Indo-Pacific approach, we need to consider the training and all this to try to penetrate new markets.
Thanks, Juan. Chris, back over to you.
Yes, I have a quick question. We haven't really spoken about Taiwan. Is there any room to expand that relationship, that trading relationship with Taiwan?
Hugh, I know you've written on this. I wonder if I can. Do you still agree with your view in the op-ed?
Well, I forget which op-ed it was, but I totally agree that we could do, and I think there are others on the panel that agree with me. We could be doing more with Taiwan without running afoul of our one China policy. China probably wouldn't like it, but they're not going to like it. And by not doing something with Taiwan, it's not going to improve our relationship with China, I would argue. I think that the best opportunity that presents itself is the CPTPP. There's absolutely no legal reason why Taiwan could not be a member. It's a member of the WTO, so why it could be part of a regional trade agreement that's consistent with the WTO. There's sort of a convention, I guess, that you should really have a bilateral agreement with China before you do one with Taiwan. The only example of that that I know of, I think, is New Zealand, and it's probably a special case because New Zealand is such a small economy. I think, frankly, we may see the U.S. Be a little bit more aggressive toward developing its economic relations with Taiwan. I certainly think we should do. I think we've been self-censoring ourselves too much. And we have to be realistic. It's 23 million people. It's an interesting market. It's not going to replace China, so we have to be careful. But there's no reason why we should be approaching Taiwan with one hand tied behind our back.
Right. Thanks, Hugh. I'm really conscious of the time, and I'm also conscious that we have a box full of Q&A. I don't think we're going to be able to do justice. to all of the questions. But I do want to give the panelists, before I wrap up and hand this back over to Chris, I just want to make sure that see if anyone has any burning points that they want to throw into the mix before we wrap up. Okay.
If I could just
yes,
just
please.
add to Hugh's comment on Taiwan, because I think is another point to look at is that there still will continue to be great interest in the China market. Taiwan is, even with the tensions between China and Taiwan, from a commercial point of view, Taiwan is heavily into China. So the capacity for companies to establish strategic partnerships in Taiwan to work in China, I think, is as an unexplored potential.
Great, thanks, Phil. And let me, before I hand this over to Chris, let me just thank you all for a totally engaging and informative and provocative discussion. The 90 minutes went whizzing by, and I think you've put so many amazing points on the table, and left me a lot to think about, and I'm sure I speak for the audience too. So thanks so much, and Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Victor. I would just like to echo your comments. I'd like to thank Mallin for doing our intro, Victor for you being the moderator today, all of our panelists and the audience as well for being with us. This was a fairly expansive panel, and we know that an hour and a half isn't enough, and that's why what we have coming up are several deep dives. And we're going to have a chat with John Stackhouse about Canadians who are out in the world. We'll be following that up with deep dives looking at Indonesia, Japan, and India. And you can find out all about those particular events by visiting the Canadian International Council website, and you'll see the events calendar there. And I encourage you to sign up for those, because we will be going into a lot more detail with those events. And so with that, a final thank you to everybody. It was great to see you all, and I really appreciate you taking the time out that you have today. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
And good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks, and good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.